We have a special guest alert because on today's show, we are bringing on draft expert Keith Sanchez from the Draft Network to tell us why Brock Bowers is the right pick for the Chargers at 5.
You are Locked On Chargers, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Chargers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, and welcome into the Locked On Chargers podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Wade, joined as always by my co-host, David Drogemeyer. We've been covering the Chargers together now for 8 seasons, but this is our 6th year as the host of the Locked On Chargers podcast, bringing you your team every day. Thank you to the everydayers for making us your first listen today, and to make sure you never miss big interviews like the ones we have on today's show, follow or subscribe for free on the Locked On Chargers YouTube channel, and listen wherever you get your podcast from. We got Keith Sanchez on today, who tells us why he loves Brock Bowers at 5, why he also loves Malik Nabers, and also tells us, what corner they could go with if they trade back, how he feels about some of the offensive line prospects, and much more. But today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Here he is, Keith Sanchez. All right, guys, you know that it's draft season, and that's why we wanted to bring on a very special guest on today's show. We have Keith Sanchez, who is a senior draft analyst for the Draft Network, but also is the host of the Locked On NFL Draft Show that's every single day with Damian Parsons. So excited to have you on, man. Such a busy time of the year for you. You can find him on Twitter. Make sure you guys follow him because I know you guys love the draft. If you have your draft questions, I got a draft guy here for you, okay? This man knows much more than I do about the draft, and you can follow him at The Talent Code on Twitter or X, whatever you call it. But thank you for coming on, man. I know it's a busy time. We appreciate your time.
Oh, no problem about all that at all. I'm excited to be in Chargers country and talk about it, right? They have a top 10 pick. They have Justin Herbert. They have a new head coach. There's a lot of exciting things going on. So let's talk some draft.
Yeah, and that's another crazy thing about your job specifically, too, because you're doing all these shows, and every team has different needs, right? So it's like you're coming up with what you think about these prospects, and then other people are having you on to say, hey, what does my team need? Where should my team go? But for the Chargers, it's kind of all over the place because they have the 5th overall pick. You could definitely make the argument that they could take a receiver, that they could take a tight end, that they could take an offensive lineman. Maybe they take the best defensive player available. That's how many holes are on the Chargers. All of those things are on the table. So let's assume that in this draft that we're doing here today, that you're the Chargers general manager, and the first 4 picks are some combination of 3 quarterbacks and Marvin Harrison Jr. That's been the most commonly mocked kind of situation, but it leaves the Chargers basically with every option outside of 1 receiver since they have their quarterback pick already figured out. So if you were in that spot at pick number 5 and you were the Chargers, which direction would you go?
Yeah, definitely. And we know that the Chargers need defensive help, right? And you said it can be at all different levels. But I think in this situation, you take best player available. And I just wrapped up my final evaluation on Brock Bowers. And I said that I believe that he's the tight end version of Marvin Harrison Jr.
Okay.
If you haven't watched his Auburn film, that was a masterpiece. That was one of the most single-handedly impressive films that I've watched, not only from a tight end, but just a skill position player offensively in a while. So I like Brock Bowers, and I like it for this reason also. He's a guy because he takes handoffs at running back, right? They run him on jet motion and jet sweeps, right? He lines up at outside wide receiver, slot wide receiver. It's hard not to get this guy to football, right? It doesn't take rocket science to draw up a play for Brock Bowers, and that's why I like it. And I believe this is sometimes when you're drafting in the top 10, that it's about going with the sure thing, right? When you start drafting for need and start reaching for a player, at times you can get in trouble doing that. So I think Brock Bowers is a highly talented player. I think he can be as talented as any tight end in the NFL in the next year or two.
Woo.
Hey, I'd love to see that. We had a pretty darn good tight end for a very, very long time with the Chargers by the name of Antonio Gates. So we know the lineage there at the tight end position, and we'd like to see that continue with Justin Herbert here. But we are also very big Malik Nabers fans here, and we probably would be our pick if the Chargers stayed there.
It's been between 5. Bowers and Nabers. That's what we keep going back and forth. Is Nabers, is it Bowers? That's kind of been where we're at right now.
Yeah, and guess what? I like Nabers also, right? Like you asking me to pick out a couple elite guys, right? So
totally.
I wouldn't be angry at all if you take Malik Nabers. And I think Malik Nabers, what he will bring to this Chargers team and offense is a little bit of grit, right? You know, we talk about these guys, not necessarily divas, but they're kind of disruptive, right? And it seems like the Chargers need some of that, right? Some of that, you know what, we're not going to lay down, or if we get punched in the mouth, we're just going to hit you right back, right? And especially offensively, because we know Justin Herbert, I believe he's a leader, right? But his leadership approach is somewhat backseat or lead by example, but you may need a vocal leader. And I don't think Quentin Johnston is that type of guy either. Keenan Allen, he'll get a little fiery, but that's not necessarily who he wants to be all the time. And then Mike Williams kind of goes about it how he goes about it also. So I think adding Malik Nabers to that situation could be really good. And he's another guy, like I said, can get the ball in his hands easily just via bubble screens, quick screens, and things like that.
Well, and I think, do you think that he would help with the explosiveness nature of it? Because the thing is the Chargers aren't going to bring back Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, which means the Chargers aren't going to bring back Mike Williams. So that's basically where it's at. But without Mike Williams last year, the deep passing game totally went down the drain, because basically their deep passing game without an elite speed field stretcher type of player was throw it up to Mike Williams. He is an 80-20 guy on 50-50 balls, and that's how we're going to create the chunk plays. Whereas it feels like, at least with Malik Nabers, it's a little bit more easy explosiveness than that, right? Like, it feels like he is someone that just by his athleticism can kind of create some of those things down the field where you're not having to throw 50-50 balls.
Yeah, definitely. And then when you have a guy with an arm like Justin Herbert, right, you want to let him use it, right? We want to see how far can he throw football.
Yeah. We do.
If he has, if his weapons are built, in this fashion, when we talk about Quentin Johnston and Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, then he necessarily can't use his A trait or the trait that may separate him from every other quarterback in the NFL. So I definitely think he offers that. But when you talk about explosive plays, Malik Nabers' run after the catch ability, I think, is something special, right? And sometimes for a quarterback, when you just need a gimme, right? And like I talked about, the quick screens are just a 5-yard pass, and you can convert that into 50 yards. You Justin Herbert, you sitting back there, you're saying, I'll take it, right? Yeah. So I think Malik Nabers offers that in multiple facets.
Yeah, and the other thing about Brock Bowers, too, because we did have a Brock Bowers question. We weren't sure where you were going to go with who you thought the top 5 pick was, but one of the things that a lot of people push back with Brock Bowers is just the fact that look at all these tight ends that were taken in the first round that were busts, right? Not to say Kyle Pitts was a bust, but he's the last guy taken in the top 5. Right. Obviously, the usage there is probably a bigger issue than him as, a player. But that's what people say. So you don't kind of buy into that philosophy of, okay, top 5 is too rich to take a tight end because of positional value and things like that.
No, I'm not extremely huge on positional value. I believe that elite players are elite players, right? If you look at the San Francisco 49ers, they have built kind of the exact opposite way of the Kansas City Chiefs, right? And both teams play in the playoffs, right? Meaning that the San Francisco 49ers, they believe in a running back, right? Which they spend a lot of draft capital on, and linebackers, right? And then you have the Kansas City Chiefs who went at it with a quarterback and a tight end, right? So I just think that you try to acquire as many elite players as possible. And to the point of Kyle Pitts versus Brock Bowers, if you ask me today, would I grade those guys? I would grade Brock Bowers over Kyle Pitts. And I haven't even said that on a Locked On NFL Draft podcast yet, right?
So you heard it here first.
Exclusive.
and the reason is that he does more traditional things. Kyle Pitts kind of leaned more on the wide receiver end, right? To where it's like, okay, how do you get him the football? But Brock Bowers, like I talk about at the beginning of the show, it's easy to get him the football, man. Let him work the middle of the field and let him be productive.
Hey, some analysts have projected the Chargers to take Washington receiver Rome Odunze with the 5th overall pick over Malik Nabers. How close do you think Odunze and Nabers are, and what do you think about Odunze's game if they go that direction?
Yeah, I think that Odunze, first of all, Odunze and Nabers, I think it's going to come down to draft day, and it's going to be an impulse decision by the general manager because they're so close in their grade, right? Ooh. But then they're also stylistically, they're different. They're different type of wide receivers in what they offer. One guy, it's 5'11", right? One guy is 6'3". But with Rome, he's predicted to run a 4.4-ish type 40, right? So you're talking about 6'4", 220, and runs a 4.4. That's something to buy in, right? But the interesting thing, the interesting thing is that Rome doesn't necessarily always play at that speed either, right? He looks more of a 4.55 guy from time to time, but I think that's because he runs his route with good tempo, which is good, right? You don't have to run full speed all the time. It's about getting open and finding those holes in the defense. So I think Rome could also be another good option for the Chargers. Just when you're talking about getting that big body frame that can move and stretch the field vertically, but also work the short and intermediate routes also.
We have more great stuff on what Keith Sanchez thinks the Chargers should do with the 5th overall pick and beyond coming up right after this. First, though, I do need to tell you guys that you could be getting buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all of your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live, same-game parlays, exclusive props, and so much more. And the other great thing, too, is even though football season is over and we're all very sad about it, March Madness is right around the corner. I mean, it is going to be the best time of the year to bet on any kind of sports with all of the madness that is coming. And if you're missing football, I totally understand it. The good news is the Super Bowl odds for the champion in 2025 are already out on FanDuel right now for the 2024 season. The Chargers are currently plus 3,000 to win it all next year. So if you really believe in Jim Harbaugh, you can get great odds. They are tied for 12th in the NFL. And I feel like, hey, before we know who is all on this team, I think that's fair. But if you guys want to get in on that action, just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Especially if they're getting rid of their big dude that they have right now with Mike Williams. So I could definitely see them, trying to do that. Especially, maybe it's a trade back situation too, because the Chargers now with Joe Ortiz, the old Ravens director of player personnel, they trade all the time. The Chargers haven't really traded at all under Tom Telesco. So that'll be interesting to see because, hey, if they move back, then a lot of options become available. Now a lot more things are on the table. But if they do stay at 5, one of the biggest pipe dreams that's out there, and every once in a while, Keith, I come across the mock draft that gets my hopes up and has Marvin Harrison Jr. making it to the 5th overall pick. So to me, I mean, wide receiver 1, I think if he's there, it's a very obvious pick of who they would go with if they were going to do that. And like you said, Brock Bowers is the Marvin Harrison Jr. of tight ends, but Marvin Harrison Jr. is the Marvin Harrison Jr. of wide receivers. So do you think there is a scenario, right? It probably have to do with how many quarterbacks are taken early on in this draft. Is there any chance he makes it out of the top 4 picks?
It is tough. I'm going to tell you what I think is going to have to happen. They're probably going to have to move up one spot. They're going to have to figure something out with Arizona, right? Because Arizona's sitting at 4, and I don't see any reason to why they wouldn't take Marvin Harrison Jr.
Right.
Now, picks 1 through 3, you can easily get over that, right? As far as just 3 quarterbacks going in the first 3. Unless somebody moves into the slot 4, if they want an offensive tackle, or they try to trade with the Cardinals, which I don't know if the Cardinals would do that because they're both trading for the same player, right?
JJ McCarthy's out there somewhere. Somebody wants to come up and get him. You know what I mean?
Well, you know what? This is your job right here, is to drive the JJ McCarthy train as hard as you can, so that way a team.
Jim Harbaugh's definitely doing it.
He definitely is. He said he's the #1 quarterback in this draft class. I mean, it's hard, because it's like I think for the Chargers, they were one Matt Prater missed field goal away from being at 4, where they would literally potentially have just the top choice of any non-quarterback in the draft potentially. And then Matt Prater 23 of 23 on game-ending kicks in overtime in the last 2 minutes of a game decides to miss his first career one. And the Chargers pick at 5, which is, hey, once Justin Herbert went down, that was the best case scenario. But, I need a little dose of reality, so I'm glad you said, hey, if you're not moving up by 1 or if somebody else doesn't come up to one of the Cardinals, Marvin Harrison Jr. is not making it past the Cardinals if they stay there.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, Kyler Murray needs a weapon, right? And so, it's hard to sit here and think that they wouldn't take the best weapon that's going to be available on the market and pair it with him. I mean, I'd love to see it, but
even though there's a ton of people now that are saying, hey, maybe Malik Nabers is actually, close to Marvin Harrison Jr., which I was surprised to see kind of start circulating a little bit. Maybe that's just draft season smoke.
Yep. Can I ask y'all a question since I'm on the Chargers podcast, right? Y'all specialize in this. I want to ask y'all, how do y'all foresee it changing offensively with Harbaugh, right? And we know that this is the same guy that ran a program that didn't throw the football in the second half against Penn State. So do you guys kind of foresee something changing or there's an evolution as far as the offensive scheme? And I believe that they brought in Greg Roman as the OC, right? You're talking about a guy that worked with Lamar Jackson and Colin Kaepernick, right? So I don't think he's going to be running the triple option with Justin Herbert. So, what are some of the things that y'all are seeing as far as potential offensive philosophy changes that could affect the draft?
More balance. I mean, they're going to run the ball a whole lot more than they did in the past. And with Greg Roman coming on as offensive coordinator, this guy pretty much runs top 10 rushing attacks almost everywhere
Wherever
that he goes.
Yeah.
So I definitely feel like a big emphasis on improving that part of the game, because the Chargers had no semblance of a running game whatsoever last year, and it really made it to where Justin Herbert had to do everything and put everything on his back. I mean, of course, with the defense being as bad as they were too, that was a big part of it. But getting bigger, more physical up front in the trenches, and just a more direct dedication to running the football, I think we're going to see that quite a bit.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think the thing is you've seen Justin Herbert play hero ball. You've seen him try to do it by himself. Okay, what does he look like if he does have a competent running game? If he has, a competent defense? And Jim Harbaugh teams, Greg Roman teams, right, usually have one of those two calling cards. So we're going to talk about the offensive line too, because it does feel like that's very much more on the table now, potentially at 5. Because, if you're going to be a trenches team, you got to be a trenches team. But I think so many Chargers fans would freak out if the Chargers don't go wide receiver or a Brock Bowers or get him a weapon at 5, that I would like to at least help them feel better about it if they don't end up getting an Odunze or Marvin Harrison Jr. or a Brock Bowers or even a Malik Nabers, right? Is there a chance in this draft class, because a lot of people say, hey, it's loaded at wide receiver, should the Chargers still feel okay if they do end up going with someone in the trenches with the 5th overall pick, or don't go offensive skill player, that they still have a good chance to get a good receiver later on in the draft?
Yeah, and I would tell the Chargers community, right, like this is a non-panic situation, just because the positional needs that the Chargers have, luckily enough, this is what this draft is deep at, right? Like if it was, if they needed corners and safeties and linebackers, I'd be like, okay, be a little bit nervous, right? But if you need offensive tackle, offensive line help, and wide receiver, then you can flip them, right? You can go wide receiver first, then offensive tackle in day 2, or you can go offensive tackle and then wide receiver. Did I just say that? Either way, you can flip them.
Yeah, I get you.
Both ways, and I think you can pan out. And honestly, if I had to pick, I would probably, if I'm sitting at top 5, I think I would probably go with the elite wide receiver, the guy that I feel like is a game changer, and then work on building my offensive line in day 2, because there are going to be a lot of guys that are simply going to fall, because a lot of teams are just, it's just not sexy to draft offensive linemen, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's going to be a lot of offensive linemen that fall.
I like that.
Yeah, that's good news. I mean, the Chargers definitely need to add a couple of pieces on the offensive line for sure. Even though most of us talk about, a offensive skill player at 5, if the Chargers do trade back, could they target one of the top corners in the draft? The Chargers get their pick of any corner in the draft. Who would you go with?
This is a really, really, really good question.
I've seen a lot of names thrown out there as CB1 this year.
Yeah, and you want to know why? It's because nobody knows.
Secret inside information.
Yeah, and I think also the reason why is because we've seen up and down film from everybody, from Terrion Arnold to Kool-Aid McKinstry to Cooper DeJean to Nate Wiggins, right? Everybody has a first-round grade on this guy and then a second-round grade, and it flips, right? It goes back and forth. So I think they definitely could trade down if they want to. What I know, and we just talked about this on the Lock on NFL Draft podcast, where I'm not sure if there's a Christian Gonzalez or a Derek Stingley in this draft.
No doubt about it.
Yeah, and like we say, picking high, right? You want a no doubt about it, guys. So I don't think this is the class where there's no doubt about it. And I like Terrion Arnold from Alabama a lot, but there's still one more stepping stone for him as far as development. I think Kool-Aid McKinstry, is probably the most consistent kind of press man guy and has been doing it the longest time, but there are some lapses for him too. So it's a tough cornerback class to kind of flush out everything and correctly peg it.
So not the best time for, the Chargers to need 2 corners probably coming out of this one. Hopefully they end up with Mike Samerstill from Michigan, because him at slot corner at the next level, I would take that, especially going into the same defense with Jesse Minter. But I mean, that's the other good thing that I'm not a draft guy, because like if your name is Kool-Aid to me, like you're gonna get like a 10% bump in your draft rate just based on the name alone. So that's why Keith Sanchez is the expert in Locked On NFL Draft, is where you go for all your draft needs. But make sure you stay there, because we have more with NFL draft expert Keith Sanchez coming up after this, talking about some of these offensive line prospects and also his favorite running backs in this draft class. First, though, I want to tell you guys about GameTime, because GameTime is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun that you're going to have. GameTime is the place for last-minute ticket deals. I go on there pretty much every day. Even if I don't have time to go to an event, I still check, because sometimes there have been tickets so cheap, right, that I have to cancel the plans I currently have. And the nice thing is also, with GameTime, you get the GameTime guarantee. And that means you'll always get the best price. Even if you find the tickets in the same section and row for less, GameTime will credit you 110% of the difference. And the other great thing about GameTime is you always see where your seat actually is and the view you're going to have for it. And you always know what the price is up front. No hidden fees and things like that. What you see is what you're going to get. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Again, that's create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the GameTime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. With Jim Harbaugh running the show, like you talked about, like that does put a more of an emphasis on potentially building in the trenches, and potentially, if they do trade back, going with an offensive lineman, right? If they don't get one of those elite offensive players at the top, if they do trade back and they have their pick of offensive linemen, do you think that they would be better off taking Joe Alt or Fashanu or someone like that, an elite left tackle, even though they already have Rashawn Slater? Or do you think you move back far enough to where you potentially just take the best right tackle, who's a natural right tackle, and not have to worry about them switching sides?
Yeah, if I'm with that hypothetical, I am trading back. And not that I don't believe that Joe Old and Olu Fashanu are extremely talented guys.
Right.
I just think that this offensive tackle class is this doggone talented. Yeah. And I mean, even if you're doing a big board and not a mock draft, right? 12 of the top 18 players are probably offensive linemen, right?
Ooh.
And I think it's that. Yeah, I think it's that talented, right? Because we don't even get into like BYU's offensive tackle, Kingsley Sumatia, Washington's offensive lineman, Troy Fontanu, Tyler Guyton, right? Just emerged from Oklahoma. So there's so many guys and so many offensive tackles. So I would trade back, and if they feel like they feel really comfortable about a guy, if you get to pick 12 or 15, and in you trading back, you're able to pick up another, let's say, second round pick in the first for next year or something like that, right?
Yeah, they need to address more holes. Like getting more picks helps them build it up faster. Yeah, right.
Yep, and I would seriously consider that if I was the Chargers, if they were to go offensive lineman.
Yeah.
Well, we talked a little bit about Jackson Powers Johnson before we started recording this show here, but only a few weeks ago, it looked like the Chargers were able to maybe get him in the second round. Now it seems like there's absolutely no chance that he makes it there with his performance at the Senior Bowl. How high do you think he could potentially go?
This is tough because I'm trying to think the last time a center was rated this high. It might have been Tyler Lindenbaum out of Iowa. Remember that? And I think Baltimore had 2 first-round picks in that draft, and they took them towards the back end of the first round. So if there's a team there that needs him, I can easily see them taking him. So if you're asking me, will he fall to the second round? Maybe, but I won't feel great about it, right? Just knowing
there's a chance.
Yeah, it's a chance. It's not the same chance that it was before the Senior Bowl. It's a lot smaller, right? But it's still a small chance.
It's still a center, though, right? Like, that's the thing. Is like, I mean, was Creed Humphrey even a first-round pick? I think he even ended up in the second round, too. So, like, I mean, center's a weird position. Even if you're the best, you might not necessarily be a first-round pick because of the positional value.
Yeah, and like you said, that name, right? Positional value, and it's a devalued position. So, yeah, that's why I would still give him the opportunity to be like, hey, he can fall to the second round just because he's a center. We know quarterbacks are going to get pushed up, and centers, running backs, linebackers are going to get pushed down.
Yeah, and the Chargers pretty much need all of those different positions. Are there any other guys that you like? Because at first, there was a lot of people saying it's basically Jackson Powers Johnson, and that's it. This is not a good center class. But then, someone like Zach Frazier gets brought up, and people start watching a little bit more of him. Are there any other guys you like at center in this draft class the Chargers could potentially swoop later on?
Yeah, I disagree with that sentiment that it's only Jackson Powers Johnson. I think this is a pretty solid center class. Good. And I'm gonna go just kind of two guys. One of them is under the radar, and then one guy is fairly known, but I think he's just kind of going through prospect fatigue. Georgia center Cedric Van Pran. I think this guy has the goods, man. Everything you want in a starting center. He's been there for 4 or 5 years at Georgia, part of national championships. He's the lead man, calls out protections. He's 300+ pounds. He can move. He's athletic, right? I think he's good enough, and we watch enough NFL football, right? Like we can't turn our nose up at good centers coming out of college, right? Because there's not a lot of good center play in the NFL. So I think he's good enough. And then a guy that caught my eye at the Senior Bowl was Arkansas center Bo Limmer. And I just finished up his draft report. And as a mid-round guy, you're talking about early day 3, I like him. He plays with the right type of grit and nastiness to him as a football player. There's just something when you watch him, like, you know what? I love that. Yeah, I can buy into this guy coming into camp, competing his butt off, and potentially starting for my team. And like I said, that's looking at, the Cowboys and the Vikings and all of these teams that need center help, right? And we watching these guys. I think Bo Limmer can definitely play up to par as a starting NFL center.
I mean, we say it a lot around here since Jim Harbaugh became the coach, but that sounds like a Jim Harbaugh type of player, a guy who's going to bring some nastiness to the table, and we need that. The Chargers absolutely need that. They need to
Corey
change.
Linsley, my man. Corey Linsley's a surprise retirement, has basically made it so I think 100% chance they're taking a center in this draft somewhere along the line. You lose Corey Linsley, you got to replace him with someone, especially because it is an important position, even if the position's devalued for sure.
Well, and you saw how good he was too, and I think that really put a bigger emphasis on having a commander in the middle.
And how much worse they were without him. And Cedric Van Pran, a guy who played with Jamari Sawyer, so maybe that is one that makes sense from Georgia. So interesting to see.
But hey, the Chargers, we talked about the running game being revamped, and the Chargers are definitely going to be taking at least one running back in this year's draft because Austin Eckler and Joshua Kelly are more than likely heading to free agency. Who are some of your favorite running backs in this year's class?
This is tough. I kind of talked about the cornerback class, and it was all over the place. Yeah. The running back class is even more scrambled.
Is it like a preference thing to you? Like it depends what you're looking for?
Exactly, and then that's exactly where I was going with. I think it's what you're going to want, right? Do you want a downhill thumper? Then you may go with Braylon Allen out of Wisconsin, right? But if you want a guy to catch the football out of the backfield, you may go with Bucky Irving, right? And then there's a guy I don't want to get his school wrong. I get all these Dakotas messed up though.
Oh no, the Dakotas are awful.
Yeah, it's the South Dakota, North Dakota, South Dakota State versus I think it's South Dakota State. I want to say his name is Isaiah Davis. 6'1", has really good feet. He could be a late round guy that emerges. He's big back, but has really good feet. So he can do some things also. And then Trey Benson from Florida State, right? He reminds me somewhat because he's a little bit high cut. Reminds me somewhat of TJ Yeldon from Alabama a couple years ago. So another talented football player. Jonathan Brooks is, he's coming off of ACL, which I just think you kind of have to see how that plays out, especially for running backs, right? So it's totally. More of a pick your flavor, like whatever the Chargers have on their team already, then you may want to go the opposite way to kind of round out that backfield.
It makes sense. And if you think about Greg Roman offenses, it does feel like it is going to be a more physical, a more north and south guy. But then you see someone like, Bucky Irving, who's just so explosive, and you just think about, okay, what could he bring to this offense? An offense that's not known for its explosiveness, right? That even if he doesn't necessarily fit into, hey, north and south, gonna knock people out, you still need that juice on your offense wherever you can find it. He's definitely somebody that caught my eye for sure. It's like, hey, if you want to, bring in another Oregon Duck to go with Justin Herbert, I'll take him. I'll take Jackson Powers Johnson, whoever they want to throw into the mix, I'm good with. But thank you so much for coming on, man. Again, if you guys are that into the draft, we know you're always in our comments asking about draft content. This is a man who puts out a daily NFL draft show, Locked On NFL Draft, him and Damian Parsons. And you can also find him on the Draft Network, which is the most comprehensive site where you can find the most draft experts who talk about all the draft all the time, every day of the year, and you're not going to find a better place for it. So thank you so much, man. Again, you can find him on X at The Talent Code. Keith Sanchez, thanks so much for coming on, man. We appreciate your time.
No problem.
Another special thank you to Keith Sanchez for coming on the show and enlightening us with some draft content because, like I said, hey, we're going to watch all these guys, but Keith Sanchez is an expert, and I think he had great answers on what the Chargers could potentially do and where they could potentially get some of these guys. So make sure you guys follow the Locked On NFL Draft Show because it's like Locked On Chargers. It's every day, and that's all they do all year round is talk about the draft. So thank you guys for checking out today's show. We'll be back with you guys tomorrow with the biggest Chargers storylines and overreactions, buying or selling them. So to make sure you don't miss it, go subscribe or follow for free on the Locked On Chargers YouTube channel and listen wherever you get your podcast from. You can also find the show on all of our social media. You can find us on X at Locked On LAC. You can find me on there at Dan Talk Sports and David Drogemeyer at Dro Talk SD, as well as on Instagram at Locked On Chargers and our Locked On Chargers Facebook page. But we're going to continue to get as many big guests as possible, maybe even some Chargers players on the horizon as well. Make sure you guys are back here for that, and make sure you're back tomorrow for the Chargers buy or sell. But until then, guys, take it easy and go Bolts.